At 4:47 a.m., the sky above Frankfurt was still plunged into deep black. The city slept, enveloped in the silence that only exists in the hours before dawn. Along Hafenstrasse, where warehouses and industrial buildings dominated the landscape, nothing moved except for the occasional glow of streetlights flickering through the rising fog from the main river. Here, on the edge of the city, where urbanity gave way to abandoned industrial areas, no one expected anything unusual. But that morning, the routine would be broken. The emergency call came in at 4:43 a.m. A male voice, nervous, reported smoke not far from the old shipping halls. "At first I thought someone was illegally burning trash," the caller later told investigators. "But the smell was different, heavier, sweeter." The fire department responded with 3 vehicles, routine for a suspected fire in an industrial area. When the first responders reached the scene, all they saw at first were flames rising from a pile on the side of the road. Tires, perhaps, or wooden pallets. But when the water put out the flames and the smoke cleared, the men froze. These weren't tires. This wasn't trash. Among the charred remains, between the ashes and melted plastic, the contours of a human body were visible. The firefighters recoiled, their faces ashen in the glow of the floodlights. One of them, a veteran with 20 years of experience, would later say, "I've seen a lot in all these years, but this is something you never forget." The police were notified immediately. Before the sun rose, Hafenstrasse was cordoned off, yellow barrier tape fluttering in the cold wind, and forensic investigators began their meticulous work. Initial investigations at the scene left no doubt. This was a violent crime. The body had not been burned in an accident. Someone had brought it here, used accelerant, and systematically tried to destroy all traces. The choice of location was no coincidence. Hafenstrasse was remote, little frequented at night, with no surveillance cameras in the immediate vicinity. Whoever had done this knew the area, had planned it, had known that no one would come by here until it was too late. In the hours that followed, while forensic technicians collected evidence and photographers documented every inch of the scene, in another part of Frankfurt, a family began to receive the most terrible confirmation of their lives. Their name was Fischer, and the woman they had been missing for 3 days had just died in the flames of Hafenstrasse. Sarah Fischer was 27 years old when her life ended in this cruel way. She was born and raised in Frankfurt, in one of the suburbs that were neither poor nor rich, but solidly middle class. Her childhood had been unremarkable, marked by school, Sunday family dinners, and the usual dreams of young girls. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, with 2 younger brothers who looked up to her and saw her as a role model. Her parents, both administrative employees, had taught their children to be honest, to work hard, and not to trust anyone who did not share these values. Sarah was warm-hearted by nature, but not naive. She had learned early on that the world was not always friendly, especially to women who had to fend for themselves. After secondary school, she had trained as an office clerk, worked in various companies, never earning spectacularly much, but enough to be independent. Friends described her as someone who loved life, who liked to laugh, but who could also be serious when it mattered. Sarah wasn't the type to be easily manipulated, a close friend would later say. She knew what she wanted, and she knew what she didn't want. But then, at the age of 24, she met Tobias Dreyer. Tobias was different from the men Sarah had dated before. He was charming, eloquent, wore expensive watches, and drove an Audi that looked like it cost more than his official income would allow. He worked, as he said, in consulting, a vague term that could mean many things and revealed nothing concrete. But he knew how to woo a woman. Flowers on the first date, restaurant visits, compliments that didn't sound cheap but were well thought out. Sarah, who had grown tired after several disappointing relationships, went along with it. Tobias seemed to promise stability, security, a future. They got married after a year of dating. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, in a chapel on the outskirts of town. Sarah's mother had expressed concerns. "I don't know," she had said to her daughter. "There's something about him that seems inscrutable." But Sarah, in love and hopeful, had dismissed this warning. "You don't know him like I do, Mom," she had replied. "He loves me. He'll take care of me." The first few months of marriage seemed to confirm this hope. Tobias was attentive, generous, bought Sarah things she would never have afforded herself: a new cell phone, jewelry, clothes. But little by little, cracks began to appear in the facade. Tobias's income fluctuated strangely. Sometimes he had money to spare, then again he seemed to be short of cash. He often disappeared for hours, sometimes for entire days, without explaining where he had been. When Sarah asked, he became evasive, sometimes irritable. "It's business," he would say. "You don't understand." But Sarah understood more than Tobias realized. She began to notice that he was cultivating contacts who seemed shady. Men who came to their home late at night, who spoke in whispers and immediately fell silent when Sarah entered the room. She saw messages on his cell phone that he hastily deleted when she came near, and she sensed that something was wrong, that the world Tobias moved in was darker than he was willing to admit. Nevertheless, she stayed. Out of love, out of hope, out of the conviction that she could change him, that the good in him would prevail. Her family noticed the change. Sarah seemed more tense, more nervous, smiled less often. When her mother visited, Sarah evaded questions and deflected conversations. "I'm fine," she said every time. But her eyes told a different story. In the spring of 2024, just under 2 years after the wedding, the situation worsened dramatically. Tobias had gotten himself into deeper debt than Sarah had realized. Investigators would later discover that he had borrowed money from the wrong kind of people, men who didn't charge interest in euros, but in favors, in loyalties, in things that couldn't simply be repaid. Tobias had become entangled in a web from which there was no clean escape. And when the pressure became too great, he began to look for a solution that would clear his debt without him having to pay the price himself. He found that solution in a man named Victor Neubauer. Victor Neubauer was no ordinary businessman. Officially, he ran several real estate companies in Frankfurt and the surrounding area and owned shares in nightclubs and restaurants. Unofficially, he moved in circles where laws were more like recommendations than rules. He was in his early 50s, always immaculately dressed, a man who exuded power without having to proclaim it loudly. His connections reached deep into Frankfurt's underworld, but also into respectable business circles. Victor Neubauer was someone you knew, but didn't talk about. Not if you were smart. Tobias had met Victor through mutual acquaintances, men who moved in both worlds. As his debts became increasingly pressing, Tobias had turned to Victor in the hope of an extension, a deferral, anything that would buy him time. But Victor wasn't interested in payment plans. He had another offer. "You have something I want," Victor had said during a meeting at one of the exclusive clubs he owned. "Your wife. I've seen her. She's attractive, intelligent, just the type I'm interested in." Tobias had protested at first, trying to suggest other solutions. But Victor was patient, yet firm. "Either that, or we'll settle your debts in another way, and I promise you, you'll like the alternative a lot less." The details of what exactly was agreed between Tobias and Victor remained unclear for a long time. But essentially, it boiled down to this. Sarah was to meet Victor, spend time with him, and do his bidding. In return, Tobias's debts would be forgiven, and he might even rise within Victor's organization and gain access to more lucrative deals. It was a cold and calculated deal, in which Sarah was treated not as a human being, but as a commodity. Tobias agreed. It is difficult to reconstruct how he got Sarah to agree to this meeting. He probably lied, telling her that Victor was an important business partner, a potential investor, someone who needed to be impressed. Perhaps he said it was about their future together, about financial security, about the chance to get out of their problems. Sarah, who still believed in the good in her husband, who still hoped that they could get through everything together, finally agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the evening of March 15th, 2024. A Friday, the end of a work week, an evening that sounded normal. Tobias was to drive Sarah to an apartment in downtown Frankfurt, a penthouse that Victor used for such occasions. "It'll just be dinner," Tobias had said. "A few hours, a little small talk, then I'll pick you up again." Sarah had put on her best blazer, applied subtle makeup, and tried to hide her nervousness. She sent her best friend a message. "Meeting one of Tobias's business partners today. Wish me luck." Her friend replied, "Be careful." At 7:30 p.m., Sarah and Tobias left their apartment. The drive through the city center took just under 20 minutes. Tobias spoke little, staring at the road, his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. Sarah tried to break the tension with light topics, asking about the business partner, what kind of person he was, what he would expect from her. Tobias gave short answers, evasive, nervous. "You'll like him," he finally said. He's influential, important to us." They parked in front of a modern high-rise, glass and steel, with a lobby that smelled of luxury. A doorman nodded to them as if he had been expecting them. Tobias accompanied Sarah to the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. When the doors opened, he turned to her. "I'll wait down here," he said. Sarah frowned. "Aren't you coming with me?" Tobias shook his head. "He wants to get to know you alone. Business discretion." Sarah hesitated, feeling a discomfort she couldn't quite place. But before she could object, Tobias had gently pushed her into the elevator. "It'll be fine," he said. "I'm here. Call me when you're done." The elevator doors closed. Sarah rode up, alone, her heart beating faster with each floor. When she reached the penthouse, the door opened automatically. A long hallway, dim lighting, soft music in the background. And at the end of the hallway stood Victor Neubauer. What happened in the next few hours will probably never be fully reconstructed. Sarah did not contact her friend again. She didn't send any more messages. And when Tobias was later questioned by the police, he claimed that Sarah had called him around 11 p.m. and said she was going to stay a little longer, that Victor was charming, and that they wanted to have another glass of wine. Investigators found this account dubious, especially since there was no call record to support Tobias's claim. What is certain is that Sarah did not leave the penthouse alive. On the morning of March 18th, 3 days after the meeting, Sarah's cell phone was found. A passerby discovered it in a trash can near Frankfurt's Ostbahnhof station, the display cracked but still functional. The police, who had meanwhile received a missing person report from Sarah's family, immediately confiscated the device. Forensic analysis showed that the last activity on the phone had taken place shortly after midnight on March 15th. After that, it had been turned off. Whether by Sarah or someone else could not be determined. Then on the morning of March 19th, the emergency call came from Hafenstrasse, the burning body, the flames that consumed not only flesh but also identity, history, the possibility of finding answers. Forensic investigators worked for days, collecting tiny fragments, DNA traces, charred scraps of clothing. Finally, after a week of intensive investigation, confirmation came. The dead woman was Sarah Fisher. The news reached the family on a Friday evening. Sarah's mother, Helga Fischer, collapsed when the officers stood at the door, their faces serious, their words carefully chosen, but unmistakable. Sarah's brothers sat silently, unable to comprehend that their sister, who just a few days ago had been alive, Laughing, hoping was now nothing but ashes. The apartment filled with screams, tears, a grief so deep that it seemed to suffocate the very air. But with grief came anger, and with anger came questions. The Frankfurt Criminal Investigation Department opened a murder investigation under the direction of Chief Inspector Michael Hartwig. A veteran with 25 years of experience, he was known for his methodical approach and his ability to see through lies. Hartwig knew immediately that this case would be complicated. A burned body, hardly any usable forensic evidence, and a husband whose story had more holes than Swiss cheese. Tobias Dreyer was summoned on March 20th. He appeared accompanied by a lawyer, an expensive criminal defense attorney from downtown Frankfurt, whose fees Tobias could not really afford. That alone raised questions. In the interrogation room, Tobias seemed nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he asked for water. Hartwig watched him silently, letting the tension in the room grow. "Mr. Dreyer," Hartwig finally began, "tell me again what happened on the evening of March 15th. Tobias repeated his story. He had driven Sarah to a business meeting with Victor Neubauer, a real estate investor. Sarah needed to make a good impression. It was important for his career. He had waited downstairs, and Sarah had called later to say she would be a little longer. "And then?" Hartwig asked. "I drove home," Tobias said. "She wanted to come back on her own." Hartwig leaned back. "Your wife disappears after a meeting you arranged with a man you yourself describe as influential. 3 days later we find her burned on an industrial road. And you didn't find that strange?" Tobias's lawyer intervened, but Hartwig ignored him. "Mr. Dreyer, we know you had debts, significant debts, to people who aren't squeamish. We also know that Victor Neubauer moves in those circles." Tobias froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Hartwig said coldly. "The only question is, what did you give Victor Neubauer to settle your debts? You didn't have any money. So what was it?" The silence in the room was oppressive. Tobias stared at the table, his lips moving, but no words came out. Finally, his lawyer said, "My client will not answer any further questions." Hartwig nodded slowly. "I thought so." At the same time, the police tried to question Victor Neubauer, but Victor was not a man who could simply be summoned. He had connections, lawyers who blocked and delayed every summons. When he finally appeared voluntarily for questioning, he was the picture of calm. A suit from an Italian tailor, gold cufflinks, a smile that gave nothing away. "I didn't know Miss Fisher," Victor said smoothly. "Mr. Dreyer may have mentioned my name, but I never met her." Hartwig placed photos on the table, surveillance images from the lobby of the high-rise, dated March 15th. A woman resembling Sarah entered the building. "The penthouse belongs to you," Hartwig said. Victor shrugged. "I rent it out occasionally. I wasn't there that evening. Can you prove that?" "Do I have to?" Victor replied. "You're the ones who need proof, Inspector, not me." The investigation hit a wall wherever Hartwig looked. No witnesses, no clear evidence, only circumstantial evidence and assumptions. But he knew that somewhere in this web of lies lay the truth, and he would find it. While Hartwig fought against walls of silence, his team made a decisive breakthrough. Sarah's cell phone, although damaged, revealed its secrets. Forensic technicians had worked for days to recover deleted messages, reconstruct call logs, and extract GPS data. What they found shook the investigation. On the afternoon of March 15th, Sarah had sent several messages to her best friend, Lisa Schaefer. "Tobias is acting strange," she wrote at 4:47 p.m. "He says I have to meet someone tonight, but he won't explain why." Lisa replied with concern, "Don't let him pressure you. If it feels weird, don't go." But Sarah wrote back, "I have to. He says it's about our future, about money we need." Sarah's last message, sent at 7:52 p.m., read, "I'm here now. It feels wrong. This man, He looks at me like... The message was cut off. It was never sent, remaining saved as a draft. Even more revealing was the GPS data. The cell phone had precisely recorded Sarah's movements. She entered the penthouse at 7:41 p.m. The signal remained there until 11:17 p.m. Then the device suddenly moved toward the East Station, where it was finally turned off at 11:54 p.m. But Sarah's body was found miles away on Hafenstrasse. Hartwig studied the maps, compared timestamps, and tried to fill in the gaps. Someone took her cell phone, he told his team. They threw it away to mislead us, but Sarah's body was taken somewhere else. The question was, by whom? And in what vehicle? Investigators combed through surveillance footage from gas stations and intersections around Hafenstrasse. Hundreds of hours of video footage, a tedious, grueling task. Finally, on the fifth day of analysis, they found something. A black Mercedes Sprinter without license plates was spotted at 2:34 a.m. on March 16th near the site where the body was found. The vehicle drove slowly, almost hesitantly, then stopped and the lights went out. 8 minutes later, the Sprinter drove away, much faster. The camera only captured a blurred outline of the driver, but one thing was clear. It was a single man, tall and broad-shouldered, not Tobias Dreyer, who was slight and of medium height. Someone else had taken Sarah there, someone who worked for Victor. Hartwig ordered a search of Victor's properties. It took weeks for the public prosecutor's office to approve the necessary warrants, with Victor's lawyers delaying every step. But finally, in early April, officials stormed the penthouse. What they found was clinically clean, too clean. No fingerprints, no DNA traces, no indication that Sarah had ever been there. Professionally cleaned, the forensic scientist concluded. Within 24 hours of her disappearance, I would say. Hartwig clenched his fists. Victor had known they were coming. He had removed every trace before the police could even react. But then they found something unexpected in the basement of the building. A surveillance camera hidden behind a ventilation grill, which Victor had apparently overlooked. The tape was still there. The technicians secured it immediately and took it to the lab. When Hartwig saw the video for the first time, he knew this was the evidence he needed. The video showed Sarah stumbling out of the elevator at 11:14 p.m., visibly confused, possibly under the influence of drugs. Behind her was Victor Neubauer, calm and in control, and a third man, unknown, who was supporting Sarah, almost carrying her. They disappeared through a side door to the underground parking garage. "Now we've got him," Hartwig said quietly. Victor Neubauer was arrested early in the morning on April 8, 2024. 16 heavily armed officers stormed his villa in Kronberg im Taunus. Victor showed no surprise, as if he had been waiting for this for weeks. He was already wearing a suit, as if he had known this day would come. "My lawyers will be here within an hour," were his only words. But the video footage was overwhelming. No lawyer, no matter how skilled, could explain why Sarah Fisher was carried unconscious from Victor's penthouse just hours before her body went up in flames. The prosecution brought charges of murder, false imprisonment, and destruction of evidence. Hartwig now focused on the third man in the video, the one who had supported Sarah. Facial recognition software provided a match. Marco Gerke, 32 years old, with multiple convictions for assault and coercion, a well-known thug from Victor's circle. The police found him in a rundown apartment in Offenbach, surrounded by empty beer bottles and the smell of despair. Marco broke down faster than Hartwig had expected. Maybe it was the fear of life imprisonment, maybe a remnant of conscience. In the interrogation room, under the bright neon lights, he told everything. "Victor said the woman would just sleep for a little while," Marco began with a trembling voice. "He had put something in her drink. She was completely out of it, could hardly stand. I was just supposed to get her into the car, nothing more. And then," Hartwig pressed. Marco swallowed hard. Victor joined us later in the underground parking garage. He said there had been complications. The woman had started screaming and threatened to go to the police. He said, Marco's voice broke. He said she had died. Just like that. Maybe an overdose. Maybe panic, he didn't know. Hartwig leaned forward. And you helped dispose of the body. Marco nodded almost imperceptibly. Victor paid me 10,000 euros. He told me to take her to Hafenstrasse and burn everything. He gave me gasoline and told me to be thorough, no traces. The words hung heavy in the room, a human life reduced to 10,000 euros and a canister of gasoline. But the biggest revelation came when Marco talked about Tobias Dreyer. The husband knew, Marco said. He sold her to Victor, literally. Victor told me the guy owed 50,000 euros to the wrong people. Victor offered him a deal, the woman for one night, and all his debts would be wiped clean. Plus bonus payments if she cooperated. Hartwig felt nausea rising inside him. Tobias knew what was going to happen. Marco shrugged. Did he know she was going to die? Probably not. But he knew what Victor wanted from her, and he drove her there anyway. The next day, Tobias Dreyer was also arrested. Unlike Victor, he immediately showed signs of breaking down. In his cell, he cried for hours, banged on the walls, and screamed Sarah's name. When Hartwig questioned him, Tobias was a broken man. I thought it was just dinner, he stammered. Victor promised me nothing would happen to her. He said he just wanted to get to know her, maybe flirt a little. I swear I didn't know. You knew exactly what kind of man Victor was, Hartwig interrupted coldly. You knew you were putting your wife in danger, and you did it anyway to save your own skin. Tobias slumped down. I didn't want her to die. You have to believe me. Hartwig stood up and turned toward the door. What I believe doesn't matter anymore. What matters are the facts, and the facts say that you sold your wife for 50,000 euros. News of the arrest spread quickly throughout Frankfurt. Sarah's family, who had lived in agonizing uncertainty for weeks, felt no relief, only deeper grief. Helga Fischer sat in her living room, surrounded by photos of her daughter, and couldn't stop crying. She trusted him, she whispered over and over. She loved him, and he betrayed her. On April 15th, the family organized a vigil in front of the Frankfurt Regional Court. Hundreds of people came, carrying candles and holding posters with Sarah's photo. Justice for Sarah was written on them. The story had shaken the city, sparking debates about violence against women, about men who exercised power over lives as if they were gods. The trial of Victor Neubauer, Tobias Dreyer and Marco Gerke began on June 3, 2024, at the Frankfurt Regional Court. The courtroom was overflowing. Journalists crowded onto the benches. Cameras waited outside for every moment. Sarah's family sat in the front row, Helga Fischer between her sons, her face a mask of pain and determination. Victor appeared immaculately dressed, his gaze arrogant, as if this were just an annoying inconvenience. Tobias, on the other hand, looked aged, his face grey, his eyes empty. Marco sat between them, his head bowed as if he wanted to become invisible. The prosecutor, Dr. Claudia Möller, an experienced lawyer with a reputation for never giving up, opened with shocking clarity. Sarah Fischer was 27 years old, she began. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had dreams, hopes, a whole life ahead of her. The three defendants took that away from her, systematically in cold blood, out of greed and lust for power. She presented evidence, the surveillance video, Marco's confession, phone records, forensic reports. Every detail painted a picture of absolute inhumanity. The defense tried to sow doubt. Victor's lawyer argued that there was no direct evidence that his client had killed Sarah. Perhaps a tragic overdose, an accident, he claimed. My client is a businessman, not a murderer. But Dr. Müller countered sharply. A businessman who drugged a woman, had her carried unconscious into a car, and had her body burned, that's not an accident. That's premeditated murder. And on the 5th day of the trial, Lisa Schaefer, Sarah's best friend, took the stand. With a trembling voice, she read the last messages Sarah had sent her. She was afraid, Lisa said through tears. She didn't want to go, but Tobias pushed her. He told her it was important. She trusted him because she thought he would protect her. Her words echoed through the courtroom, and several jurors wiped their eyes. Then Helga Fischer spoke. She stood up, her body fragile but her voice firm. "My daughter was not an object that could be bought or sold," she said, looking directly at Tobias. "She loved you. She believed in you. And you delivered her like cattle to a butcher." Tobias broke down, sobbing loudly, but Helga did not turn away. "You will have to live with this guilt every day, every night, until your last breath." The evidence was overwhelming. Marco had already confessed. His sentence was a matter for negotiation. But Victor and Tobias fought to the end. Victor's team tried to portray him as the victim of false accusations, but the surveillance video refuted every lie. Tobias' defense attorney argued mental stress, debt, desperation. "He made a terrible decision, but he didn't want murder," pleaded the lawyer. Dr. Müller stood up for her closing argument. Tobias Dreyer sold his wife for money. Victor Neubauer treated her like a commodity. Marco Gerke burned her like trash. 3 men, 3 decisions, 1 dead life. Sarah Fischer deserves justice, and this society deserves to know that such acts will not go unpunished. On June 28th, the court announced its verdict. Victor Neubauer, life imprisonment for murder with particular severity of guilt. Marco Gerke, 12 years for aiding and abetting murder and disturbing the peace of the dead. Tobias Dreyer, 18 years for aiding and abetting murder by causing a life-threatening situation. When the verdict was read out, Helga Fischer cried out, not with joy, but with pain, because no punishment could bring her daughter back. Outside the court, hundreds of people gathered, applauding, crying, holding banners reading, "Sarah, we will not forget you." But for the Fischer family, the fight was not over. Justice had been served, but the wound would never heal. The months after the verdict were no easier for the Fischer family. The trial had given them answers, but those answers brought no relief, only a deeper understanding of the extent of the betrayal. Helga Fischer sold the house where Sarah had grown up. Every room reminded her of her daughter. Every corner echoed with memories that were now tinged with pain. She moved in with her youngest son in Wiesbaden, a smaller apartment, less past. But the nightmares followed her. Night after night she saw Sarah in front of her, heard her voice, woke up drenched in sweat, knowing that her daughter would never come home again. Therapists talked about trauma recovery, about time healing all wounds. But Helga knew better. Some wounds don't heal, they just become quieter. Sarah's brothers struggled in their own ways. The older one, Thomas, became an activist against domestic violence, giving talks at schools, warning young women about the signs of controlling relationships. "My sister didn't see the warning signs," he said at an event in October 2024. Tobias slowly isolated her from us, from her friends. He controlled her money, her time, her decisions. We thought it was just jealousy, normal relationship problems. We had no idea how deep it went. The younger brother, Matthias, withdrew, barely speaking for months. He quit his job, holed up in his apartment, obsessively scrolling through old photos of Sarah on his phone. It was only when Thomas found him crying on the kitchen floor one night, a bottle of whiskey beside him, that they sought professional help together. "I should have protected her," Matthias repeated over and over. "I'm her brother. That was my job." In Frankfurt itself, the case sparked a social debate. Women's rights organizations organized demonstrations demanding stricter laws against human trafficking and better protection for women in abusive relationships. The Sarah Fisher case became a symbol, a memorial to how quickly trust can become a trap, how love can be used as a weapon. The media reported on it for months. Talk shows discussed it, newspapers analyzed it, podcasts retold Sarah's story. But with every report, with every headline, Helga felt more alienated. "They talk about my daughter as if she were a statistic," she said to a journalist who asked for an interview. "She was a human being. She loved vanilla ice cream and old movies. She laughed loudly and cried secretly. She wasn't just a victim. She was Sarah." In March 2025, a year after Sarah's death, the family organized a memorial service. Over 300 people gathered on the banks of the main river, where Sarah had often played as a child. Candles were lit, flowers were placed in the water, and Sarah's favorite songs were played. Lisa Schaefer, her best friend, gave a speech that left hardly anyone dry-eyed. "Sarah believed in the good in people," Lisa said. "Even when Tobias changed, when he became colder, more controlling, she believed that love would save him. That was her strength and her tragedy. She loved too much, trusted too deeply." Lisa paused, tears running down her face. "We can't bring her back, but we can learn from her death. We can show other women that there is no shame in leaving when a relationship becomes toxic. That survival is more important than loyalty." Chief Inspector Hartwig attended the memorial service, standing slightly apart from the crowd. After the ceremony, he spoke to Helga Fisher. "I wish we could have been quicker," he said quietly. Helga shook her head. "You did what you could. The culprits are behind bars. That's more than many families ever get." But the question that no one asked aloud, yet everyone was thinking, remained. Could Sarah have been saved? Could anyone have recognized the signs earlier? Her mother pondered this endlessly. The moments when Sarah had become quieter, the times when she cancelled visits, made excuses, the change in her eyes, as if a light were slowly going out in them. "I asked," Helga once told her therapist. "I asked Sarah if everything was okay, and she said yes. She smiled and said yes." "What more could I have done?" The therapist had no satisfactory answer. Sometimes there isn't one. Victor Neubauer served his sentence at Frankfurt prison with the same arrogance he had shown in the courtroom. He continued to claim he was innocent, a victim of circumstances and false testimony. Other inmates reported that he talked about lawyers and appeals, convinced that he would be released one day. But the evidence against him was too overwhelming. Public opinion too decisive. Tobias Dreyer was the opposite. He was housed in Butzbach prison in solitary confinement for security reasons. Fellow inmates who learned of his crime made it clear what they thought of men who sold their wives. Tobias received multiple death threats and was attacked twice in the courtyard. He hardly ate, lost 20 kilos, and his hair turned grey. A prison chaplain later reported that Tobias spoke of Sarah in every pastoral care session, of the remorse that consumed him. "I see her every night," Tobias had confided in him. "She stands at the end of my cell and looks at me, doesn't say a word, just looks." The chaplain asked if it was his conscience. Tobias shook his head. "Conscience would be too kind. This is hell." Marco Gerke, who had received a more lenient sentence because of his confession, showed genuine remorse. He wrote a letter to Sarah's family, which was never answered. It said, "I know that words don't change anything. I know that apologies are meaningless when someone is dead. But I want you to know, not a night goes by that I don't think about her, about what I did. I am a coward, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it." Frankfurt moved on, as cities do. New headlines replaced old ones, new scandals overshadowed past tragedies. But on Hafenstrasse, where Sarah's body was found, a small memorial appeared. Someone had laid flowers, a photo of Sarah, a candle. No one knew who it was, but every week new flowers appeared, as if the city itself wanted to remember. The biggest change came in the form of legislative initiatives. The Sarah Fisher case led to the tightening of criminal laws regarding human trafficking and aiding and abetting violent crimes. Women's shelters received more funding and prevention programs were expanded. It wasn't justice for Sarah, but perhaps it would save other women. 2 years after her death, in the spring of 2026, Helga Fischer visited Sarah's grave for the first time without breaking down. She laid white roses, Sarah's favorite flowers, and spoke softly to her daughter. "I hope you are free now," she whispered. "Free from pain, free from fear, free from men who thought they could own you." The wind carried her words away over the graves, over the city, into a sky that remained indifferent. But for Helga, it was a beginning, not of healing, not of forgetting, but of acceptance. Sarah was gone, but her story, her pain, her death had taken on meaning. Not the meaning anyone would have wished for, but one that might touch other lives, might save them.